Whether relative or stranger, friend or foe, when people talked about Edward Dingle, they always used the same word: average. His detractors might add that he was mediocre or basic, and his friends might augment the description with the words reliable or classic, but it all boiled down to the same thing. In almost every way, Edward Dingle was close to average, luxuriating in the median and gregarious with fashion. Here was his height, 5 feet 9 inches, average for an American. His build was neither thin nor fat, neither overly muscular nor particularly weak. And his clothes, pants or shorts for the weekend and suits for the week, in fabrics that could be as at home on the couch in a dentist's waiting room. As for his children, Edward Jr. was 19 and Ginny was 20, both studying for B's at the state's second-best university. Mr. Dingle's house was a handsome, clapboarded, reasonably sized, painted a reasonable gray with a white fence and a flower garden that took up too much of his time. His job was quite satisfying and acceptable, a senior loan officer at the First National Bank of Centerville. On his way to and from work, he could often be heard whistling one of his favorite songs. The works of the band Nickelback regularly came to mind, as well as a few other ditties from past top 40 lists. The average American family has 2.5 children. In Dingle's case, the 5th child was occupied by Rafi, a slightly spoiled gray mixed-breed dog who looked just like the third picture that appears when a person types the word mutt into Google. The dog was beloved by Dingle and his wife Jane. Ah, Jane Dingle. She, too, was of average height, 5 feet 4 inches from the sole of her sensible shoes to the top of her brunette curls, helped by regular but not excessive visits to the hairdressers. She had normal, if not average, 34C breasts, and a fairly normal height-to-weight ratio. And, like her husband, she had a pleasant, albeit garden-variety job. She was the number 2 agent at World on a String, the best travel agency in town. If there was anything remarkable, though perhaps still average, about the Dingles' lives, it was their shared love. Married for 22 years, they went out to dinner once a week and cuddled on the couch every night. Mrs. Dingle wasn't the biggest Nickelback fan. Her tastes leaned more toward Kelly Clarkson and, occasionally, Weezer. But if pressed, she had to admit that few things sounded better than "If Today Was Your Last Day" when played from the safe circle of her husband's embrace. The Dingles demonstrated their love in perfectly ordinary ways. For him, it was carnations once a week and roses once a month delivered to her office. They had dinner every Friday at one of their favorite restaurants and went to movies and dances with enviable regularity. He was already saving for their 25th wedding anniversary, a trip to Hawaii. Where else? As for Mrs. Dingle, she too showed her love in ways that were close to average. Baked goods were delivered to his table every Monday, usually chocolate chip cookies or brownies, though she once ventured into Blondie and walnuts, which she later wrote off as a midlife crisis. And she often tried to spice up their sex life, though the spices were admittedly mostly cinnamon and nutmeg. Victoria's Secret lingerie, pink, of course, and tricks she'd heard about from her girlfriends, like how to meet him home from work in nothing but saran wrap. Needless to say, she looked through the peephole before opening the door. The Dingles' 22-year affair did not go unnoticed. Criticizing their unimaginative and mediocre displays of affection became a popular pastime in both offices. "Chocolate chip cookies again?" grumbled Ian Peterson, an accountant in Mr. Dingle's department. "She sent them last week, too." "No, there were brownies last week," objected Joe Staley, a marketing associate who regularly stopped by for free snacks. "Boy, those cookies taste like my grandmother's." "Yeah, she puts vanilla in them," Ian said. "My mom used to do that, too." "I think my mom was the last person to bake cookies for me," Joe reflected. "It's been a long time," Ian agreed, remembering the girl in college who baked red velvet cupcakes. Across town at the World on a String was having a similar discussion. "Red roses? Again?" snorted Christina Hausman, sitting 2 desks away from Jane Dingle. "Seriously, does he get all his date ideas from books?" "I know," said her friend Bernice Kay, sitting at a neighboring table. "Maybe something like 50 romantic gestures that were boring when your grandparents were kids." Christine giggled. That's so cute. I need insulin. What about those carnations every week? Couldn't you make them more versatile? And don't get me started on Valentine's Day, Bernice moaned. A heart-shaped sampler and a pink teddy bear that says, I love you. And, of course, a dozen red roses! They cheered in unison. A moment later, I don't know the last time someone bought me chocolates, Kristen reflected. I think my dad was the last person to get me a stuffed animal, Bernice added. And I had to have my tonsils removed first. And so the Dingles lived their perfectly ordinary lives, with their perfectly ordinary love and the occasional teasing from co-workers. And it might have gone on for the rest of their lives, if the Venusians hadn't come to town. The morning of the visitor's arrival began as usual, with Mr. Dingle lying curled up next to his wife. When the alarm clock rang, he turned it off and cuddled with Jane for another minute, breathing in her scent and savoring her warmth, before disentangling himself from the tangle of sheets, his wife, and Raffi. The usual shower, shave, and breakfast followed, and not half an hour later he was out the door, dressed in his favorite suit and ready to face the day. The morning was sunny, and Mr. Dingle decided to go to work on foot. He had barely reached the corner of Oak and Elm Streets, less than a block from his house, when he felt a strange vibration in the area of his left shoulder. He considered it a muscle spasm and turned onto Oak Street. Mrs. Collins, a widow in a large Tudor-style house at the intersection of Oak and Elm, happened to be in her garden that morning and noticed Mr. Dingle walking by. It wasn't unusual. On average, he walked to work 3 times a week. But there was something about him that morning, something impressive in his gait, a firmness and determination that brought back memories of Herbert. Silly old woman, she chided herself. 5 years since he died, and you still think of him every day. But Widow Collins was not the only one who noticed something different in Mr. Dingle. Mrs. Bondar of number 22 thought it might be a new hat, and Mrs. Maxon of number 34 was sure it must be a new suit. Miss Wade thought it had to do with his smile, and Mrs. Sissy of number 46 could not determine what it was, but was sure she had never seen a more attractive man. At First National Bank, too, the change in Mr. Dingle had not gone unnoticed. Angela Hortick thought it might be a new cologne, and Ann McDermott wondered if he was exercising. Marcia Lenchner noticed that his eyes had turned a particularly mesmerizing forest color, and Lawrence Unsini was mesmerized by the delicate hair on his wrist. Julie Ruhlman realized that he reminded her of her father, the best man she had ever known. Jan Peterson and Joe Staley, it should be noted, didn't discover anything special, although both regretted not having fresh baked goods that day. Perhaps the most surprising person to notice Mr. Dingle was Miss Durney. Nicknamed Burton by her co-workers, she came to be known as Albertina, and often thought that her odd nickname may have been an unfortunate attempt to pronounce Bertina. She told herself it was further proof of the failure of the American educational system. Regardless, Miss Durney considered herself a social justice warrior, and had long since dismissed Mr. Dingle as just another patriarchal white male who took his undeserved privileges for granted. That morning, however, she found him particularly compelling. She furrowed one bushy eyebrow, trying to figure out what it was, his steely posture that seemed ready to storm the barricades, his cold, commanding gaze that seemed unafraid to meet the establishment's weapons, his scent, a manly musk with indescribably delicious notes of tear gas and patchouli. While she tried to sort out her feelings and figure out what she was attracted to, Miss Durney was rearranging the straps on her canvas backpack. This was usually done on Sundays, when she chose her priorities for the week and arranged the ribbons accordingly. But today she noticed that her purple ribbon depicting animal abuse looked especially appealing next to the white ribbon depicting child exploitation. Peachy uterine cancer went very much with blue short bowel syndrome. Maybe not all men are instruments of patriarchy, she thought, and then she thought, what the hell is wrong with me? Mr. Dingle, for his part, was unaware of the heightened emotions and startling sensations coursing through his office. First up, at 9:30, was Mr. Futterberg, who was applying for a loan to expand his sporting goods store. He was followed at 10:15 by Mr. Taylor, who wanted a loan to build a swimming pool. Both went through the usual average interview. Mr. Futterberg readily agreed, and Mr. Taylor seemed completely unconcerned that he would probably never recoup his investment in the pool, and his application went through as well. Then, at 10:45, Ms. Doris Cranch entered the room. Miss Cranch, who prided herself on her meticulousness as a businesswoman, kept all the paperwork in order. However, when she reached across the table to hand Mr. Dingle the last 3 tax returns, she found herself leaning further over than usual and casting a long look at the top of her blouse. "What am I doing?" she asked, shocked at her behavior. "He's married!" "What is she doing?" retorted Mr. Dingle with slight embarrassment. "I am married." Miss Cranch sat up abruptly with her back against the hard office chair. She avoided Mr. Dingle's gaze and breathed a sigh of relief when he lowered his eyes to consider her statement. But then, despite her intentions, she felt her knees move apart, then drew together, then spread again, a little wider. "Stop it," she said to herself. Unfortunately, her body didn't listen. Unaware of the battle raging inside his client, Mr. Dingle focused on her application. Everything was in order. She had made more than 20% down payment, had an excellent credit rating, and a stable, high-paying job. But he still felt anxious. The uneasiness grew even worse when he noticed her legs spreading. Spread, 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 sliding apart. "Ms. Crunch!" he exclaimed. I'm sorry," she replied, clutching her knees. I was out of sorts this morning." She wiped droplets of sweat from her forehead. "Perhaps I should reschedule for next week." "That's probably best," Mr. Dingle agreed. "Your application is in order, and approval should just be a matter of dotting the I's and T's. Just call my secretary and we'll make an appointment." "Thank you, Mr. Dingle," Miss Crunch said, avoiding his gaze as she gathered her papers and walked slowly to the door. "I'll see you next week." "Great, Miss Crunch, I'll see you then," he replied, as he watched her walk away, swaying her hips. Although Mr. Dingle tried to be gracious, his encounter with Miss Crunch left him shaken. Fortunately, he didn't have to meet any more customers that morning. However, his day was no less unusual or less disturbing. At 11 o'clock, he received a call from Miss Hortick, who needed help with her computer. Although the bank has a help desk, many employees found it condescending and avoided contacting it unless absolutely necessary. In the loan department, Mr. Dingle had developed a reputation for being helpful with computer problems, so it was not surprising that Miss Hortick sought his help. What was surprising, however, was how the atmosphere changed when he left his office. The common room was hotter and more humid than usual, as evidenced by the blush that flooded every woman's cheeks and the undone buttons on every blouse. Shaking his head, Mr. Dingle headed for Miss Hortick's office. She too was flushed and, stammering, explained her problem to him. Standing beside her chair, he noticed that several buttons were undone on her blouse, and that she was wearing a black bra. He soon realized that her problem, the label she'd removed, was easy to solve. Suspiciously easy. "Already better," he told her, straightening up. She bit her lip. "Thank you, Mr. Dingle," she sighed. "Have a good day." "You too, Miss Hortick," he replied and hurriedly withdrew. Returning to the safety of his office, Mr. Dingle noticed a crumpled scrap of cloth on the desk. Picking it up, he saw that it was red panties, quite wet and with lots of lace. Not knowing what to do, he placed them on the poofy behind the table. Perhaps the hostess would want to pick them up later. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. Meanwhile, some of the women who had seen Mr. Dingle that morning found their imaginations drifting toward banking. Mrs. Sissy realized she had a pressing question about deducting interest for tax purposes, and Miss Wade pondered buying and renting. Mrs. Bonder pondered that it might be time to replace her old car, and Widow Collins pondered whether she should use a home improvement loan to build a sex room. In all cases, they knew from whom they could find the answers they needed: Mr. Dingle. By 1 o'clock, Mr. Dingle had worked on most of the computers in the office. Ms. McDermott needed a reminder on how to cut and paste text, and Mrs. Lenchner couldn't remember her password. Mrs. Sonsini couldn't find her web browser, and Ms. Ruhlman seemed puzzled by the light switch on her extension cord. Even Ms. Durney, who was usually one of the most technically literate in the office, seemed to have forgotten how to find the files on her desktop. Watching her lick her light fur-covered upper lip, Mr. Dingle felt a shiver run down his spine, and every call from the technician seemed to bring a special package to Mr. Dingle's desk. Panties and then bras in a variety of colors went into his bureaus, and then into a stack that he gathered on his poof. His office, he thought, was beginning to look like a thrift store, and the smell was reminiscent of the odor from a bed and breakfast. When he first entered, Mr. Dingle's calendar was free for the afternoon, but he soon found it filled with people coming in for appointments. At 1:30, Mrs. Sissy came in for tax advice. She had forgotten to bring her returns, much less receipts, but from the way she touched her hair, licked her lips, arched her back, and did gymnastics in her chair, it looked like she was preparing an interpretive dance. Mr. Dingle was sure it wasn't the federal tax code that inspired him. He recognized that, lacking the proper credentials, he could advise nothing, and sent her on her way, offering to make a follow-up appointment. However, Mrs. Sissy was barely out the door when she was replaced by Mrs. Bondar, who wanted to discuss the purchase of a new car with him, even though she had not researched the make or model, had not brought an income statement, and did not know what her credit rating was. As he walked her out, he noticed that a crowd of women had already gathered at his office door, including Mrs. Sissy, who seemed to be settling into one of the chairs. Widow Collins had barely begun to outline her plan for home improvement when the voices outside the door grew louder. "What did you say, Mrs. Collins?" asked Mr. Dingle. "I'm asking if I can deduct the cost of the chair from the Filipino basket if I use it to entertain my banker," she exclaimed. "I'm next," proclaimed a voice from the other side of the door. "Hell no," replied the other. "I've been waiting." "Fuck you. We've all been waiting." "What's a Filipino basket chair?" asked Mr. Dingle. "I need help with my computer," shouted a voice. My floppy disk needs a hard drive." "Nobody uses floppy disks anymore, you slut." "Well, it's—" Mrs. Collins began, but then they started pounding on the door with their hands. "Let us in," said one of the voices. "I have to discuss tax expenditures and deductions." "Yes, deductions," exclaimed another voice. "Rising interest rates. Take a long position. Pump and dump." "I can't hear myself think," shouted Mr. Dingle. "You all must go." "Hell no, we're not leaving," shouted a familiar voice. "Make love, not war." They began banging on the door, further distracting Mr. Dingle's attention from the increasingly agitated Mrs. Collins. "Mr. Dingle," she exclaimed, "I want your advice. What would be better for furniture, satin, or leather? Which will depreciate longer?" Sensing he was distracted, she began undoing the buttons on her blouse. Worried that the door might break, Mr. Dingle at first paid no attention to Mrs. Collins's desperate attempt to get his attention. However, when she began to remove her bra, he was simultaneously surprised, impressed, and shocked. "Mrs. Collins, that— Stop that!" he hissed, retreating to the window. "But, Mr. Dingle, I need your advice," she sighed, looming over him. "Lace or leather? Lingerie or suits? We must consider the overall aesthetic." Attempting to open the window, Mr. Dingle found it unlocked and quickly swung it open. Thanking the powers that be for giving him an office on the first floor, he jumped outside just as his door gave way. Without thinking, he rushed running toward the house. Behind him, he heard the crowd climb out the window and pour into the front door of the bank. "He's getting away!" Whips or canes? A cat with 9 tails? Roses every month. "We can handle him together, Edward. There's room in my staff for you, too." Watching him rush down Oak Street with the crowd following at his heels, the Venusians turned to each other. "I think that's enough," Skilla said. "Agreed," Trilla said. "We have more than enough data." There was a barely perceptible vibration in the air. A barely perceptible shock went through Edward Dingle, and a moment later the women in the crowd began to ask themselves why they were following this rather ordinary-looking man in a tattered gray suit. As they turned back toward their homes and offices, one lingered a moment longer, looking after him as he ran home. "Roses every month," Christina Hausman whispered. It was noon on Friday at the World at Arrowhead, so Jane Dingle came home early from work. When Edward Dingle came to the door, she was already waiting for him, wrapped in saran wrap. "You'll never believe the day I've had," he told her. She smiled at him. "Well, come in and tell me about it." "Why are you dressed like that again?" "Don't like the suit?" She purred, holding out one end of the plastic to him. "Just hold this piece while I leave," she laughed, wiggling her ass seductively. Across town, Skilla and Trilla were preparing to board their flying saucer when another one landed next to them. "Martians," Skilla moaned. A hatch opened at the base of the other ship, and two men dressed in red satin gladiator uniforms stepped out. "I am Lorax," one of them said. "And I am Gygax," said the other. The Venusians rolled their eyes. They were Martians. Of course they were men, and of course their names ended in X. "We are Skilla and Trilla," Skilla said. The Martians rolled their eyes. Women with A names, wearing revealing green satin dresses. They were Venusians, of course. "Why are you here?" asked Lorax. "We were testing a new beam," Trilla replied. "A sonic andro-libido transducer." "I assume it's some sort of audio-vibration physio-muscular device to enhance male attractiveness?" asked the Lorax, raising an eyebrow. "It also has a digital watch," Skilla quipped. "Liquid crystal display." Gygax smiled. "So it's basically a Venusian stallion." "To put it crudely," Trilla replied. "What are you testing?" "Something similar," Lorax admitted. "A sonic gyno-libido transducer." Skilla grinned. "You mean the Martian whore ray?" "If you want to be rude," Gygax snorted. "I see yours doesn't have a watch," Trilla remarked with a smirk. All four aliens remembered why war had once broken out on their planets. "Perhaps we can help," Skilla said in a conciliatory tone. "What are you looking for?" "A truly average woman," Lorax said. "Preferably married." "It's hard to find truly average people these days," Skilla admitted, "but we have someone who might be a good fit. Have you heard of Mrs. Dingle?"